When Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke on July 10th, he described his country's two biggest enemies in simple terms: Terra and winter. By Terra, he meant Russia itself, its military, its land, and its aggression. By winter, he was talking about the season that has haunted armies for centuries on the icy plains of Eastern Europe. At first glance, Zelensky's comment about Russia having few true allies may sound convincing, but then you see Vladimir Putin shaking hands, smiling, and laughing with leaders from across Asia and the Global South at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin, China. It's hard to ignore the fact that Russia still enjoys strong ties with powerful nations like China, India, Iran, and North Korea. Add to that Russia's role in international groups like BRICS and the SCO, and the idea that Moscow is completely isolated starts to look shaky. But the second part of Zelensky's warning, about the coming winter, hits much closer to home. For centuries, Russia has relied on brutal winters to defend itself from invaders. The season has earned its own nickname, General Winter, or in Russian, General Moroz, General Frost. The word Moroz carries a harsher, tougher edge than Zima, winter, and for good reason. These aren't the kind of winters you simply endure with a thicker coat. We're talking about nights so cold that temperatures dive well below freezing, sometimes dropping to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds that cut like knives and blizzards that bury everything in sight. It's not hard to see why so many foreign armies have failed here. History books are filled with stories of mighty powers who marched confidently into Russia, only to be stopped dead in their tracks by hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion. The first big example comes from the early 1700s, when Sweden's king, Charles XII, thought he could outsmart the Russian Tsar. He led 35,000 men into Russian territory during the Great Northern War. The Russians didn't meet them head-on. Instead, they burned their own villages and fields as they retreated, leaving the Swedes stranded without supplies. Then came the Great Frost of 1709, one of the harshest winters Europe had ever seen. To give you an idea of how bad it was, even the canals of Venice, usually mild, froze solid. The Swedish army, stuck out in the open on the windswept steppes, never stood a chance. By the time spring arrived, Charles XII had lost nearly half his men, and soon after, his forces were crushed at the Battle of Poltava. That defeat didn't just end his campaign in Russia, it marked the decline of Sweden as a great European power. 100 years after Charles XII's failure, another would-be conqueror set his sights on Russia, Napoleon Bonaparte. In the summer of 1812, his Grand Army, an enormous force of over 400,000 soldiers, poured across the border, determined to march all the way to Moscow. The Russians, once again, refused to play by the usual rules. Instead of standing their ground, they pulled back, torching entire villages, fields, and food stores as they went. By the time the French reached deeper into Russian territory, there was nothing left to eat, nothing to use, and nowhere to shelter. Even before the brutal cold set in, Napoleon's army was crumbling. By October, more than 4 out of every 5 men who had begun the invasion were already dead, deserted, or too sick to fight. The French entered Moscow expecting victory, but found a city in ashes. With supplies gone and reinforcements delayed, Napoleon had no choice but to retreat. Then came the frost. The soldiers' winter uniforms, meant to shield them from the Russian cold, never arrived. Men marched through snow and ice in thin summer coats, their boots falling apart. Hunger gnawed at them and frostbite spread like wildfire. By November, the roads were littered with the dead, men who had collapsed in exhaustion and never stood up again. Napoleon's trusted aide, Armand de Caulaincourt, later described the horror. The cold was so intense that bivouacking was no longer possible. One constantly found men overcome by the cold, lying on the ground, too weak or too numb to stand. Once these poor wretches fell asleep, they were dead. By the time Napoleon stumbled back into France, his once mighty Grand Army had been reduced to a pitiful shadow of itself. Fast forward to 1941, and history repeated itself. Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion the world had ever seen. Nearly 4 million German troops stormed across an 1,800-mile front into Soviet territory, facing around 3 million Soviet defenders. At first, it looked like another easy victory for Germany. The Wehrmacht advanced with terrifying speed, capturing millions of prisoners, seizing land, and leaving unimaginable destruction in its wake. Civilians were deliberately starved under the Nazis' so-called hunger plan, designed to feed German troops while killing off local populations to make way for German settlers. But Hitler made a fateful decision. Instead of striking straight at Moscow when he had the chance, he diverted massive forces to Ukraine. The campaign dragged on for months longer than expected. By September, the Germans had taken Kiev, but that delay gave the Soviets time to regroup and pour fresh forces, and more importantly, their new T-34 tanks, into the defense of Moscow. The German High Command had assumed the campaign would be finished before winter. They were disastrously wrong. By the time December rolled around, the German army was battered, undersupplied, and unprepared for the coldest winter Europe had seen in decades. Tanks refused to start. Lubricants froze solid. Soldiers wrapped themselves in newspapers and rags, in a desperate attempt to survive temperatures that plunged as low as minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the backdrop that created the myth of General Winter, the idea that Russia's icy weather by itself defeated the world's greatest armies. But historians like Chu argue the truth is more complicated. Winter certainly played a role, but it wasn't the whole story. Napoleon's troops were already weakened by hunger, disease, and massive losses like the bloody Battle of Borodino, where tens of thousands fell before the cold even set in. Hitler's forces, too, were victims of their own arrogance, stretched supply lines, and terrible planning. In other words, it wasn't just winter that broke them. It was winter piled on top of mistakes, exhaustion, and hubris. The same pattern showed up in World War II. By the time Hitler's armies reached the outskirts of Moscow in late 1941, they were already bleeding. The Wehrmacht had lost more than 700,000 men before winter even showed its teeth. Supplies were running thin, fuel and food were scarce, and long supply lines stretched all the way back to Germany. When the snowstorms rolled in and temperatures dropped to deadly lows, the army collapsed. But it wasn't just the cold that did them in. Winter was the hammer that delivered the final blow, but the cracks in Hitler's campaign had appeared months earlier. His men were exhausted, underfed, and fighting battles they hadn't planned for. The cold didn't create those problems. It simply magnified them until the whole machine broke down. Ukraine, though, isn't repeating the mistakes that swallowed Napoleon and Hitler. Thanks to NATO partners, its soldiers are outfitted with proper winter gear. Everything from insulated clothing to cold-resistant modifications for weapons, vehicles, and communication systems. They're preparing not just to survive the cold, but to fight effectively in it. There's another big difference this time around. Russia is the one on offense. Historically, winter in Eastern Europe has favored defenders. The side holding the ground usually has shorter supply lines and access to shelter, houses, barns, and basements, while attackers are often left shivering in open fields, makeshift dugouts, or half-frozen trenches. During earlier invasions of Russia, this advantage belonged to Moscow. But now, Ukraine is the one defending its homeland, with all the winter know-how it gained from centuries spent within the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union. That's why Russia seems to be pushing so hard at the tail end of this summer campaign. Its forces want to lock down urban positions, places like Pokrovsk, Kostiantynivka, Seversk, Liman, Kupiansk, and Hulia-Pole, before the real cold sets in. If they fail, they may have to retreat and shelter farther back, leaving Ukrainian troops in stronger positions with roofs over their heads and supply depots close at hand. Technology also tilts the balance toward defenders in today's war. The age of massive surprise offensives is basically over. Drones, satellites, and surveillance systems watch almost everything that moves, and large troop buildups are spotted and destroyed before they can even launch an attack. Even Russia's recent breakthroughs, like in Avdiivka and Sudza, came with heavy costs and relied on rare moments of tactical surprise. In winter, when bare trees strip away even the limited cover the landscape provides, sneak attacks will be even harder. All of this makes General Winter more of a friend to Ukraine than to Russia this time. But before either side has to contend with the deep freeze, there's another enemy to get through. General Mud. Eastern Europeans know him well. When fall rains or spring thaws soak the soil, fields and roads dissolve into oceans of muck. The Russians call it Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads. Ukrainians call it Bezdoja, which simply means roadlessness. Tanks bog down, supply trucks grind to a halt, and soldiers slog through knee-deep mud just trying to move a few miles. Without the brutal cold to freeze the ground solid, maneuvering armies becomes nearly impossible. It's not hard to see how these nicknames, General Mud and General Winter, came about. Every spring as the snow and ice melt, the steppes and forest floors dissolve into a sea of sludge. The same thing happens in the fall, when early snows melt back into waterlogged fields. Modern tanks might have engines far more powerful than their World War II counterparts, but they're also massive machines weighing dozens of tons. Once they sink into mud, they're just as helpless as the clanking armor of a century ago.
If you've made it this far into the video, it means you're enjoying what we do here at Euro Bulletin. Take a second to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more updates and insights from Europe and its partners. Let's dive in more into the subject.
The same goes for armored personnel carriers, towed artillery, mobile air defense systems, and even the trucks that launch drones. Russia in particular has learned this lesson the hard way. It's estimated that they've already lost more than 20,000 pieces of mobile equipment during the war. Many of those losses were caused not just by Ukrainian firepower, but by the terrain itself. Ukraine's small first-person view FPV drones, which cost a fraction of what a tank does, have destroyed thousands of vehicles. Analysts believe that as many as two-thirds of Russia's 11,000 destroyed tanks were knocked out while they were immobilized in mud. Public data on losses is patchy, but one trend is clear. Both sides suffer their heaviest equipment losses during the muddy seasons. In summer, heavy machinery can at least move through fields and forests without sinking, even if drones make movement risky. But once fall comes and the ground softens, armor is forced to stick to roads, where it becomes an easy target. Then, when the mud freezes, everything changes again. Snow and ice may be miserable for the soldiers, but they create a solid surface for tanks and other heavy weapons to move more freely across the countryside. The ever-present danger from drones doesn't go away, but the sheer number of usable routes increases dramatically. That's why this moment, the transition from late summer into autumn, is so critical. Right now, both armies have hundreds of thousands of troops dug into trenches, foxholes, bunkers, and fortified lines stretching across the front. Russia's priority is to claw its way into key cities like Pokrovsk, Kostiantynivka, Seversk, Lyman, Kupiansk, and Huliopol before the mud sets in. Inside a city, Russian forces could shelter in buildings and basements rather than freezing in exposed trenches. For Ukraine, the mission is the opposite: keep the Russians out at all costs. Because if Moscow manages to establish footholds and consolidate supply lines during the muddy season, the fighting that follows in winter will likely turn into brutal urban warfare, the kind of building-to-building, room-to-room grind seen in Mariupol, Bakhmut, and Toretsk. And this brings us to the final reason why General Winter may not favor Russia this time. The way warfare itself has changed. Ukraine already holds the natural defender's advantage, shorter supply lines and better shelter. But now it also has modern tools that can multiply that advantage. We're talking about swarms of short-range FPV drones, longer-range loitering munitions, NATO-supplied missiles, and an ever-expanding arsenal of locally made strike weapons. Together, these give Ukraine the ability not just to hold the line in winter, but to use the season as a springboard to drive Russian forces back. Ukraine's best shot at flipping the script this winter is to do to Russia what the Soviets once did to Hitler's army, but this time with drones, satellites, and precision weapons. The Russian forces sitting furthest forward are also the most vulnerable. They're dug into exposed positions at the end of long, fragile supply lines that stretch back across occupied territory and into Russia itself. Cut those lifelines, and the front starts to unravel. The first step in such a strategy would be to carve out kill zones around these advanced Russian positions. Think of it as a 10 to 20 mile wide circle of death. Anything that tries to move in or out, whether it's a fuel truck, an ammo resupply, or reinforcements, gets hunted down by FPV drones or precision artillery fire within minutes. Ukraine has already proven it can do this. Around cities like Bakhmut and Kostiantynivka, Russian advances ground to a halt once Ukrainian drones saturated the area. The Russians pushed within a few miles of the cities, then simply stalled, unable to move supplies or troops without taking punishing losses. At the same time, Ukraine has been stepping up attacks on the supply networks that keep Russia's war machine running. Roads, railways, bridges, and depots are all fair game. Just in recent weeks, Ukrainian strikes have hit a key bridge in Russia's Bryansk region and rail lines near Melitopol in occupied Kherson. And there's been a noticeable shift in Ukraine's drone strategy too. Instead of spreading out strikes across dozens of targets to stretch Russian air defenses thin, more raids now focus on hitting the same high-value site multiple times in succession. The goal seems clear. Don't just dent the enemy's logistics, smash them. If Ukraine can pull this off, the result would be devastating for Russian troops on the front. Cut off from food, fuel, and ammunition, they would be left freezing in trenches with no lifeline. That kind of isolation leaves only two choices: surrender or be wiped out. History has already shown what happens when Russian forces face this kind of pressure. In both Kharkiv and Kherson in 2022, when Ukrainian counterattacks overwhelmed their supply lines, Russian troops didn't dig in, they bolted. The challenge, of course, is getting through the muddy season without losing ground in key contested cities. If Ukraine can deny Russia those footholds and survive the worst of General Mud, it will be in a position to unleash General Winter against the invaders. By February or March, when the ground begins to thaw again, Ukraine could be entering the next stage of the war from a position of real strength. So what might this winter actually look like? A lot depends on who adapts faster to the changing battlefield. Scenario 1. Ukraine turns the tables. In this version of events, Ukraine successfully holds the line in cities like Pokrovsk, Kostiantynivka, and Kupiansk, denying Russia the warm shelter of urban strongholds. When the rains give way to ice and snow, Ukraine locks down kill zones around Russia's exposed forward units, cutting supply lines with drones, missiles, and precision artillery. Isolated Russian troops, stranded in trenches with dwindling food and ammo, face the same fate their predecessors once inflicted on Napoleon and Hitler's armies: starvation, frostbite, and collapse. Ukrainian drone swarms and long-range strikes keep pressure on railroads, depots, and bridges deep in Russian territory, leaving Moscow scrambling just to keep its front alive. The result could be a series of localized Russian retreats, much like Kharkiv and Kherson in 2022, but spread more widely across the front. Scenario 2. Russia digs. But there's another possibility. Russia's summer push may give it just enough footholds inside contested cities before the mud season shuts down large-scale maneuvers. If Russian forces can entrench inside these urban centers, winter turns into a very different kind of fight. Brutal, house-to-house combat where neither side can easily maneuver, and drones can't always find targets hiding in basements or fortified buildings. In this case, Ukraine could be forced into exhausting battles of attrition, similar to the meat grinders of Mariupol or Bakhmut. Supply lines may still be vulnerable, but if Russia holds tight in urban positions, winter might freeze the conflict into stalemate rather than collapse. The truth is, both paths are possible. What's clear is that General Winter won't simply decide the outcome on his own. He'll punish whichever side makes the bigger mistakes, just as he did to Napoleon, Hitler, and countless others before.